Hi everyone, and welcome to this week's Crime and Punishment story. This week I am covering the case of Edward Smith and the murder of Elizabeth Smith, which took place in Gateshead in 1872. I hope you will find it interesting. Unfortunately, due to other commitments, I have not actually been able to get any location pictures, so most of the pictures will be just old photos of the area, etc. But before we begin, can I just say, if you do enjoy this video, then please give it a thumbs up, and if you are new here or haven't already done so, then do please consider subscribing to the channel to help support the content we create. Thank you. And I would just like to add that I always do these days, that I do record these stories live, so I do sometimes make mistakes, which I always try to rectify, so I hope this does not spoil your enjoyment of the video. There is little to no information on the backstory of either Edward or Elizabeth, so the details will be very, very basic. Edward Smith was said to be around 67 years old at the time the crime was committed. However, I did find some information suggesting that he may have been quite a bit younger, but almost all of the news articles gave his age as either 66 or 67. He was described as a bricklayer and lived in Sutherland Street in Gateshead, and his place of birth and parents are unknown. Elizabeth Smith, the victim, was said to be around 68 years old at the time of her death. However, again, I did find information suggesting that she was slightly younger, but the news articles all suggest she was 68. She was married to Edward and lived in Sutherland Street. Her place of birth and parents are unknown, and it is also unknown if the couple had any children together, but I did not find any details of either any children or other family members during my research into this story. On Saturday, May the 25th, 1872, Edward and his wife Elizabeth had been out for a drink or two in the local pubs of Gateshead. It seems that the pair had been out for most of the day and were quite drunk, and they were also not always together, both entering pubs at different times. Both were argumentative, and Elizabeth argued with one man in the Argyle Hotel in Gateshead and was asked to leave by the landlady. Although it's not known when Elizabeth returned home, she was said to be already inside when Edward returned just before midnight. As soon as Edward went inside, the neighbours heard him arguing with Elizabeth, and shortly after this they heard noises as if someone was falling down, but after a while all was quiet. The following morning, at around 5 a.m, Edward went downstairs to his neighbour, Mrs. Peevely, and asked her to come up as he believed his wife was very ill. She followed him to their rooms, and on entering she found Elizabeth lying on the floor. She was covered in blood, and there was also a lot of blood around the room. Mrs. Peevely believed that Elizabeth was dead, but Edward said she was not. Mrs. Peevely sent for Joseph Scarth, and he helped Edward to lift Elizabeth onto the bed. It was then that Mrs. Peevely realised that Elizabeth was indeed still alive, so she immediately sent for the doctor. Dr. Bannon of Gateshead arrived a short time later, and he found that Elizabeth had several wounds to her head and face, including 2 very black eyes. The wounds did not seem to be bleeding anymore, but she had lost a lot of blood and was unconscious. Dr. Bannon watched over Elizabeth for the next few hours, but she sadly died from her injuries at 3 p.m. on Sunday afternoon. P.C. Clark of Gateshead was also called to the house. He immediately noticed the disarray in the room. Broken crockery lay all around the floor, a lot of which was stained with blood. The windowsill and the walls were also marked with blood. He arrested Edward Smith on suspicion of seriously assaulting his wife, to which Edward replied, "I was asleep, I know nothing about it." And after Elizabeth's death, the charge was changed to willful murder. The inquest was held at the Argyle Hotel in Gateshead. No details were given as to who had identified the body of Elizabeth Smith, which is unusual, but in this case it was not noted. Esther Dunn said she was the landlady at the Argyle Hotel and had last seen Elizabeth Smith at around 10 p.m. on May the 25th. She said Elizabeth had been quite drunk and was arguing with other people in the pub, so much so that she had asked her to leave, which Esther said she had done. She said Edward had been in the pub earlier that same evening and he had also been drunk and very noisy. When asked, she said she had not seen the couple together that night, so she did not know if they had argued with each other or just with strangers. At this point, Edward asked Esther if she had ever seen him mistreat his wife, and Esther said she had not. In fact, she said he had always been very kind to his wife whenever she had seen them together. Susanna Scarth said she lived next door to Edward and Elizabeth in Gateshead. She said Elizabeth had been in her house around 8 p.m. on May the 25th. She had already been the worse for drink then, and she had gone out again after about half an hour, and she said she did not see her again that night. She said she saw Edward later that night and he was also very drunk. The following morning, at around 5 a.m., she said that her neighbour, Mrs. Peevely, called at her house and asked her husband to help put Elizabeth into bed. Her husband later asked her to go to the home of the Smiths, and she said that the sight in the room made her feel sick and she had to leave. Elizabeth was covered in blood and looked to be dead to her. There was blood all around the room and broken crockery covered in blood was strewn about the floor. She said she heard Edward say it had been an accident. When asked, she said the couple often got very drunk and would argue a lot, but she had never seen Edward ill-use his wife. Mrs. Peevely said she lived in the rooms below the Smiths in Sutherland Street in Gateshead. On the night of the 25th, she heard them both arguing at some time around midnight, and it also sounded to her like one or both of them fell onto the floor. She said the noise continued after she herself went to bed, but this was not unusual for the couple as they often argued when they had been drinking. She said she clearly heard Edward call out to his wife a little before dawn, but she said she did not hear Elizabeth reply. Around 5 a.m, Edward knocked on her door and asked her to go to see Elizabeth. He said she was very ill. Mrs. Peevely said she did not believe him at first and did not go, but he knocked twice more, so she eventually went upstairs. She said she was shocked when she entered their rooms. Elizabeth was lying on the floor covered in blood. Edward asked her to go for a doctor, but believing Elizabeth was already dead, she said she told him it was too late for a doctor. However, Edward insisted she was still alive and just drunk, so she went for a neighbour to help move Elizabeth onto the bed. And as Elizabeth was moved onto the bed, Mrs. Peevely heard her breathing faintly and immediately sent for a doctor. She said the room was full of a lot of broken crockery, and a lot of which was smeared with blood, and she spoke to Edward saying, "You'll get wrong for this," and he replied saying it was only an accident. At this point, Edward interrupted, asking Mrs. Peevely if she remembered him telling her how it had happened, and she replied saying, "You said it was an accident." And he responded by saying, "I found her on the floor when I got out of bed. I don't know how it happened. She must have fallen on the china and cut herself." Mrs. Peevely ended by saying that after the police and doctor arrived, she stayed with Elizabeth until she died on Sunday afternoon. She said she never regained consciousness, so she was never able to say what had happened. When asked, she said she believed that Elizabeth had always been the boss of the house and Edward had simply done as he was told. She said she had never seen Edward raise a hand to his wife. Joseph Scarth said he lived in next door to the Smiths in Gateshead. He had been up for work at around 5 a.m. on Sunday, May the 26th, when Mrs. Peevely came asking for his help. He said after placing Elizabeth on the bed, he had told Edward, "This is a bad job," and Edward had replied, "It's only an accident, she will be better soon enough." After this, he said he left the house to find a doctor and he did not go back. P.C. Clark said he had been told of an incident in the Sutherland Street area and had immediately gone to the house. He had arrived before the doctor and just as the previous witness had been placing Elizabeth onto the bed. The room was very much in disarray. Broken crockery lay all around the floor, and blood was smeared on the windowsills and the walls. Elizabeth looked in a very bad way. She had many injuries to her face, including 2 black eyes. And, he said, Edward's clothing had been marked with blood in many places, and he could not seem to explain how the blood had got there. After this, he said he had taken Edward into custody, charged with assaulting his wife. Edward had claimed to know nothing about it, saying he had been asleep and had woken to find his wife on the floor. Pacey Clark said after Elizabeth's death, Edward was charged with her murder, to which he made no reply. At this point, Edward interrupted Pacey Clark, saying, "With respect, the blood had got onto my clothing when I helped Joseph Scarth to lift Elizabeth onto the bed." Dr. Bannon said he had been called to the house of the Smiths a little after 6:30 a.m. on the morning of the 26th. He had found Elizabeth lying on the bed, covered in blood and barely breathing. She had many wounds to her face, one so deep he said he could see the bone beneath. She also had 2 black eyes and cuts to her fingers and knees. He said he had later performed the post-mortem on Elizabeth Smith and found that she had a lot of blood on the brain, and this he believed had been the cause of her death. He said that during the post-mortem he had seen signs that she had been a very heavy drinker, but this had not been the cause of her death. At this point, Edward asked the doctor if he remembered him saying it had only been an accident, to which the doctor replied yes. And he also asked if he remembered that he had told him to take care of Elizabeth and that he would pay him for his trouble, and Dr. Bannon said yes, he also remembered this. The coroner then spoke to the jury, saying that he felt this was a clear case of Edward having used violence towards his wife and causing her death, and it was now for the jury to decide if they also felt that this was the case. He could not, however, see any evidence to suggest that this was a premeditated murder, as the couple had both been very drunk and had argued that night, as stated by several of the witnesses. The jury retired for a very short time before returning a verdict of guilty of manslaughter against Edward Smith, and he was committed for trial. I did not find any evidence of a funeral for Elizabeth Smith. It is quite possible that the couple had very little money, so the funeral was possibly a pauper's funeral, and details may not have been covered by any of the local papers. I did not find any evidence of a headstone for Elizabeth in the Gateshead area. The trial took place at Durham in July of 1872. Edward pleaded not guilty to the charge, and Edward was also not able to afford anyone to defend him. Often the judge would ask someone to take the case, however, this had not been asked for on this occasion. The majority of the evidence at the trial was the same as at the inquest, with only the new information being as follows. Pacey Clark was asked to show the jury the broken crockery found lying round the floor. Most of this was smeared with blood. Some, it was said, showed that someone may have fallen on the items, causing them to break and injuring the person who had fallen onto them. Edward's blood-stained clothing was also shown to the jury. Dr. Bannon was then asked if he felt that the wounds found on Elizabeth's body could have been caused by her falling heavily onto them in her drunken state. He said it was his professional opinion that some of the wounds may have been caused this way, but he felt that some could not. Some were, he thought, too deep to have been caused by a fall. After all the evidence was given and before the prosecution could make their closing argument, the judge addressed the jury. He stated that the couple were known to be very heavy drinkers and known to argue on a regular basis. However, he had seen no evidence to suggest that Edward had ever ill-used his wife. In fact, it had been stated that he was always very kind to his wife. He felt that this was a case of accidental death. Elizabeth had been very drunk and had fallen several times and caused her own injuries herself. He felt that the blood on Edward's clothing was from him helping to lift his wife onto the bed, and he then directed the jury to find Edward not guilty, which they immediately did, and Edward was then told he was free to go. I did not find any evidence of Edward after this that could be 100% proven to be him. However, it is possible that he did later remarry and continued to live in the area until at least 1891. This was a very strange case. The evidence was clear that the couple were big drinkers and often argued, but there was no evidence to suggest either were violent to each other. Of the two, it seems most thought Edward to be kind to his wife, and that Elizabeth was in charge, with Edward simply doing as he was told. I have to admit to finding it hard to believe that Elizabeth could have sustained such serious injuries just by falling onto crockery, but, of course, if she was very drunk, she could have fallen several times, making the injuries worse, and being drunk could have led to worse bleeding, as is often the case. But I did wonder if Edward was being entirely truthful. Did he actually see his wife fall? Did he simply ignore her, thinking that she would be fine, or did he really sleep through it all? He did protest his innocence throughout the inquest and the trial, but of course all those accused in previous stories have done the same. But it does seem that the jury had no choice but to find him not guilty at the judge's direction. But what do you think? Do you think Edward was innocent and Elizabeth had simply fallen heavily onto the crockery several times due to her drunken state? Or do you think it was possible that Edward had been responsible for her death, but because of drink was not able to remember any of it and truly thought that he had done nothing? Do let me know your thoughts in the comments below. I do hope that you have found this sad and tragic story interesting, and I do thank you all very much for watching, and I do hope to see you all again very soon.